The December wind in Nebraska was not just cold, it cut through flesh like a dull blade, leaving raw burns where it passed. On a trail crusted with ice, Evelyn Carter pulled her old wool scarf tighter around her neck, each breath turning to a thin wisp of smoke that vanished before it reached the air. Her worn shoes sank into frozen mud, every step heavy as though she carried her whole bleak past upon her back. She had walked 8 miles from the stage stop, 2 days on an empty stomach, 14 months on an empty heart, ever since her husband fell, leaving her alone in a world with no room for poor widows, and even less for a black one. When the wind tore away the fog, the house appeared. A long, low cabin hunched against the prairie storm. Behind it, barns and fences stretched into the haze, not quite ruined, not thriving either. Its weary look mirrored a man forced to endure long after his strength was gone. Evelyn stopped, her palm tightening on the strap of her bag. The trader in town had looked at her with that mix of pity and suspicion, saying only, "Try the Hale Ranch. Might be they need help." That might was all she had left to wager. She knocked. The sound on hollow wood echoed like a fist on a coffin lid. For an instant, old memory rose. Another door, another man, her husband's body brought back in a wagon, his face broken by hooves. She shook her head hard, driving it off. The door swung open, and a man filled the frame. Thomas Hale, tall, broad-shouldered, his face carved harsh, as if the land itself had cut him from stone. Every line stern, gray eyes cool and judging. Not threatening, not welcoming, only a verdict already decided. "We don't need anything," he said, his hand moving to close the door. "Wait." Her voice cracked, hoarse from wind and hunger, but desperation gave it strength. "I heard you might need help. I can cook, mend, clean. I've worked cattle before. I'll do anything." He paused, eyes raking over the patched dress, the calloused hands, the sun-darkened skin of too many miles. Evelyn felt herself weighed and measured like a horse on an auction block. "No pay," he said flatly. "Just shelter. Just food." The words leapt before pride could stop them. "Through the winter. I'll work my keep." The silence stretched, broken only by the gale against the walls. Then Thomas spoke, his voice low, dragged from a chest bound tight by cold wind. "There's only one job here. Wife." The word fell heavy, colder than the snow outside. Heat rushed to Evelyn's face, shame and fury alike. She had come to beg for labor, not to barter her body. Yet in his face she saw no jest, no lust, only a bare, ruthless bargain for survival. "I'm not that kind of woman," she said, her tone steady though her hands trembled. "Never said you were." He shifted slightly, letting a sliver of lamplight spill out. A bare kitchen, a wooden table with 3 chairs, only one worn from use by the jalsa, hearth, a child's toy horse lay forgotten. "I've got a son, 6. He hasn't spoken a word since his mama died last spring. The house needs a woman's hand. The boy needs someone. I need a wife, not a worker, not a boarder." Evelyn's heart clenched. A child, motherless, silent with grief. She knew that hollow silence. After James died, she too had lived in a world without words. "That isn't marriage," she murmured. "Marriage is a bargain. Folks dress it up with pretty names. I've no time for pretty." His answer cut like steel. She should turn away, let the storm flay her face, walk on into the dark. But there was nowhere left. Her last coin had bought the coach fare. Inside stood a boy locked in silence, and within her a stubborn ember still burned, the will to live. "All right," she heard herself say. "I want to see the boy first." For a moment the man's hard mask cracked, not softened, but acknowledging. He stepped back, door wider. "Come in. Stand out here and you'll freeze." She crossed the threshold. The cold clung, then loosened to the meager warmth of the house. The room was broad, lonely, sturdy furniture gone dry for lack of care. Dust traced months of widower's neglect. A movement at the doorway froze her. A slim figure lingered in shadow. Wide, dark eyes gleamed against the dim. The boy. Evelyn slowly bent down, lowering herself to his gaze. She spoke no word, offered no hand. She let him choose. The seconds stretched stiff, wind rattling the window panes. Then he stepped out, slow, holding a small wooden horse. He did not hand it over, only raised it as if to show her a guarded secret. His eyes met hers, silent, piercing, testing if trust could take root in a stranger. In that gaze Evelyn knew, whatever bargain she struck with Thomas Hale, she had not come here only to survive. She had come to fill a hollow space, and that hollow, in turn, was beginning to fill her. The first morning at the Hale Ranch began not with a rooster's crow or soft rays of sun, but with silence so thick Evelyn felt the cabin had never known human life. Wind slipped through the cracks of the planks, moaning low like the voices of wandering spirits. She woke on a narrow bed tucked at the end of the hall. The thin blanket, the scent of old wood, all of it recalled the makeshift quarters given to colored laborers during the war. Places meant only to keep flesh alive, not to offer comfort. Stepping into the hall, she realized the house was larger than she thought. Yet every corner bore the absence of a woman's hand. Frames hung crooked on the walls. Dust lay thick on the shelves. The stove was cold, with only gray cinders left behind. At the table stood 3 chairs, 2 barely touched, one worn smooth at the backrest. Evelyn brushed it with her fingertips, the chill sinking into her palm, as if she had touched a life she did not belong to. On the shelf by the wall sat a vase of faded flowers, stems brittle and broken. Beside it, a silver comb with teeth snapped and strands of brown hair darkened by time. Evelyn understood. The woman of this house still lingered in these objects, a ghost no hand could sweep away. She had once sat in this chair, combed her hair at this window. And Evelyn, the one come after, was being asked to step in, to carry on, but never to replace. The heavy thud of boots on the porch startled her. Thomas Hale entered, carrying the bite of hay and cold air. He set his hat on the table, his glance brushing over her, neither lingering nor cold, just brief acknowledgement. "Coffee's in the pot, if you want." His voice was rough, clipped. She nodded, found the blackened kettle, poured 2 cups. The metal stung her fingers with heat. When she passed one to him, her hand brushed his calloused one. Only a second, but the spark was there, quick as a struck match. They said nothing. Drank. The coffee was bitter, harsh, like the only language they could share. From the doorway behind, Caleb appeared. He clutched the wooden horse tight, hair falling across his brow, dark eyes fixed on Evelyn. He did not speak, did not smile, only stood, measuring what this stranger would do. Evelyn eased into her chair, her tone gentle. "That's a fine horse. Did you make it yourself?" Caleb blinked but gave no answer. Slowly, he walked closer, set the wooden horse on the table beside her. She reached out, touched it, then handed it back. Her fingers brushed his small hand, warm, trembling. Life itself, fragile and uncertain, placed in her palm. For a heartbeat, his eyes held hers. Not just silence, but a heart waiting to trust. Across the table, Thomas watched. His stony gaze shifted, not softening, but unsettled. He had seen the boy hide for nearly a year, refusing all, even his father. Yet now, he stepped forward, dared to place his treasure in a stranger's keeping. Evelyn bent close, smiling faintly, speaking no more. She knew words could shatter what was fragile. Small gestures, steady presence, that was enough to plant a seed. Thomas cleared his throat, pushed back his chair. Work in the barn needs doing before the sun's high. I'll be out. He left, but his last glance lingered on the sight of Evelyn and Caleb, joined by a simple toy horse. The door shut. Wind howled once more. Evelyn ran her fingers over the carved mane, the warmth of the boy's hand still clinging to hers. The house remained empty of laughter, barren of joy, but she had seen a crack of light in the dark, and within her a fragile hope stirred, that her presence here might yet mean something. That afternoon, as pale light slipped through the cracks in the cabin walls, Evelyn sat at the long table, her hands laced tight against the rough wood. All day she had worked, sweeping dust from summer past, stirring a fire in the dead stove, trying to press life back into corners that had grown hollow. Yet the harder she tried, the clearer it became. This house had never been opened to anyone beyond the memory of the woman who was gone. Thomas came in at dusk, the fields swallowed by shadow. He carried the smell of hay and winter earth, his boots caked with frozen mud. He stripped off his coat, set his hat hard on the table as if that motion alone had become his habit. Evelyn watched him a breath longer than she meant to, then drew in air to steady herself. This was the moment to speak, whether her voice broke or not. Mr. Hale. He lifted his head, gray eyes sharp, that guarded look he always wore. The coldness of it almost crushed the words in her throat. But she thought of Caleb, the boy clutching his wooden horse, staring at her with eyes she could not shake. She would not live here as a shadow. If you truly want a wife, she said, each word firm, then I must be a wife in truth, not a ghost to stand in another's place, not an empty name for folks to call. I need a room of my own, not a corner, not a cot, but a place where I belong. And I need a voice in this ranch, kitchen, market, even the land when spring comes. Otherwise, I'm nothing more than a servant without wages, and I will not live like that. The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, wind clawed at the eaves. Inside, her heart beat too quick, each thud louder than sense. She was certain she had ruined everything, that he would turn, order her out into the night. But Thomas Hale did not raise his voice. He only stood, looking at her long, steady, until she felt as if he were cutting down to her soul. Then, with no warning, he nodded once. Fine. One word, dry as dust, heavy as stone. Evelyn froze, scarcely believing she had heard right. You don't object? I didn't bring you here to play housemaid. If you carry the name of wife, then you'll have a place in this home. Take whichever room you see fit. The market, the kitchen, yours to mind. The land is mine to decide. But if you've thoughts, I'll listen. I said before, no use for pretty talk. A wife is a wife. Something stirred in her chest. Not warmth, not joy, but recognition. His words were rough, his face still cut from stone, but he had granted her standing here, a claim beyond survival. The small door creaked. Evelyn turned to see Caleb step out. He held his wooden horse close, paused, then for once did not slip back into shadow. He came forward, stopped beside her chair. His round eyes moved from father to her, weighing, choosing. At last, he leaned his thin shoulder against her side, small and certain. Evelyn laid her hand gently on his shoulder. He did not pull away. A quiet moment, small but complete, a sign of trust. Thomas looked on, and for the first time the iron gray in his gaze shifted, not softened but cracked, as if a warmer wind brushed across his weather-worn face. It passed quickly. He turned, bent to stoke the fire. But Evelyn had seen it. In that fleeting instant she knew. An unseen thread had begun to tie the three of them together. And for the first time since crossing this threshold, the house no longer felt drowned in shadow. Morning laid a film of white mist across the prairie. Frost clung to stiff grass, catching light like shards of glass, while inside the Hale cabin the chill of dust and old ash still lingered. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, her eyes roaming the room. Once another woman's hands had shaped this space, kept it neat, set fresh flowers in a vase, filled it with laughter. Now all that remained were tired traces of neglect. Caleb slipped in quietly, dark eyes fastened on the wooden horse he always carried. He lingered by the door, neither coming closer nor turning back. Evelyn bent, picked up a worn rag, then glanced at him with a faint smile. "Would you like to help me?" She didn't expect words, only held out a clean cloth. The boy hesitated. Slowly he stepped forward, took it from her. His small fingers brushed hers, warm, trembling. Fragile trust was being passed across that touch. All morning they worked side by side, wiping shelves, stacking dusty books. On top of a cupboard, Evelyn spotted a picture frame lying face down. She reached, but her arm fell short. Caleb fetched a stool, climbed up, and carefully handed it down. Their hands met on the cold wood of the frame, eyes lifting to one another, uncertain, but no longer entirely guarded. Inside was a photograph, a young woman with brown hair loose around her shoulders, cradling an infant Caleb. Her gentleness seemed to spread into the room, pressing on Evelyn's chest with a heavy ache. She set the frame upright, brushed the dust away, as though promising not to erase the woman's presence. At noon, Evelyn found a small notebook tucked in a drawer, handwriting slanted and fading. Inside were recipes, one for a simple cake of flour and molasses, perhaps the late wife's hand. Evelyn paused, then decided to try it. The kitchen, long cold, came alive with fire's warmth. She kneaded dough. Caleb stood watching, eyes wide. When a smear of flour streaked her nose, he let out a quiet laugh. The first sound of joy, quick and shy, but strong enough to shake her heart. "You can stir for me," she said gently, sliding the bowl toward him. He nodded, slow but sure, taking the wooden spoon. His small hand circled clumsily in the mix. Evelyn placed her hand over his, guiding. He did not pull away. When the cake was baked, the sweet scent of molasses filled the kitchen. She cut a slice, set it before him. Caleb hesitated, then bit. The soft sweetness melted on his tongue, and his eyes lit up. Then, a smile, full and unguarded, breaking through a year of silence. Evelyn stilled, throat tight, unwilling to disturb the fragile gift. She only reached out, brushing his hair back. The boy looked up, trust shining between them like a taut thread. At the doorway, Thomas Hale stood, silent, unseen until now, his eyes fixed on the sight. His son, whom he had failed to draw from grief, now smiling because of this woman. He said nothing, did not enter, only clenched his fist at his side until his thoughts knuckles went pale. For the first time, the cold gray of his gaze glimmered with a crack of something else. In the kitchen, Evelyn offered another piece of cake. Caleb accepted, their hands touching once more, his smile lingering. And in that moment, the long-dead hearth was lit again, not only with wood and flame, but with the presence of someone willing to stay. That winter came harsher than any reckoning. Snow swallowed the paths, ice sealed the streams, and the wind lashed long and hard as though it meant to tear the last remnants of life from the prairie. The Hale Ranch, already thinned from the failed harvest, held only a few sacks of seed, some shriveled potatoes, and a handful of lean cattle clinging to survival. Thomas Hale worked from dawn until the dark, as if pausing for a breath would bring ruin down upon them all. He split wood, mended fences blown apart by gales, checked on the livestock. His clothes soaked in sweat, then froze stiff against his body. Evelyn watched him wear himself thin, every motion etched with the burden of keeping a household from breaking. The toll showed in the cracked flesh of his hands, torn open like dry earth under drought. One evening he staggered inside, coat heavy, fingers bloodied and raw. He dropped the bundle of wood with a thud and sank into the chair as though he'd come back from war. Evelyn fetched a clean cloth and a tin of salve she had unearthed from an old chest. "Leave it," he muttered, voice ragged. "No." Her tone was calm, unyielding. "You keep those hands like this, you'll have no strength tomorrow." He meant to pull away, but the steadiness in her gaze stilled him. She sat across from him, lifted his coarse hand, skin split deep, red seeping into old scars. Her fingers were soft, warm, utterly opposite. She worked the salve in slow strokes, pressing gently along the veins and creases. Thomas stared into the fire, breath thickening. He said nothing, but the silence was no longer cold. It weighed heavy with something else, a closeness he had not allowed himself in a long while. Evelyn said nothing either. She only felt the thud of her own heart as her hands passed over his. That large, battered hand had borne the whole weight of this house. Now it was covered by hers, not in pity but in quiet sharing. Caleb sat near the hearth, wooden horse in his lap, dark eyes watching every gesture. When Evelyn finished binding Thomas's palm, she lingered by the fire to dry the cloth. The boy crept close and then slipped his small hand into hers. Evelyn froze, then curled her fingers gently around his. Warmth spread from his touch, chasing out the deep cold. He said nothing, only leaned his head against her arm, eyes fixed on the flame. Evelyn closed her eyes a moment. This was the first time he had chosen her. Not with a look, but with touch, certain and trusting. When Thomas turned, he saw it. His new wife at the hearth, his silent son clutching her hand, the two bound together in stillness. He flexed the hand she had tended, strange stirrings moving beneath the frost he had buried in himself long ago. That night, the three sat around the rough table. Supper was no more than stale bread and thin broth, yet the hollowness had lifted. Evelyn set the small piece of meat into Caleb's bowl first, then Thomas's. He glanced at it, then pushed it back, leaving more for the others. Evelyn did not speak, but when her eyes met his, they carried a softness that unsettled him. The house, once so bound in silence, began to find its own rhythm. The shuffle of Caleb's steps across the floor, the clink of dishes as Evelyn laid the table, the sighs from Thomas that no longer sounded so sharp. A shared cadence, fragile but real, a family's pulse. Outside, the storm still raged, shrieking to bury them, but inside, by the glow of fire, 3 people sat close, hands linked to hands, and the price of winter, loneliness, loss, was being met by a bond no blizzard could undo. The wind howled like 1,000 wounded beasts, tearing across the Nebraska prairie in a night black as coal. Windows rattled, the wooden frame of the cabin shuddering as though it might splinter apart. Inside, Evelyn stood frozen before the hearth, hands clenched tight. Thomas had left at dusk, saying only he'd check the horses and fetch more hay. He promised he'd be back before dark. But the storm had come early, and now midnight had passed. Caleb huddled near, wooden horse pressed against his chest, dark eyes wide and unblinking. Each time the gale slammed against the roof, he flinched and looked to Evelyn. In his gaze she saw her own fear, the dread that the man would not return. She could not wait longer. Evelyn threw on her wool cloak, tying it firm at her throat. Kneeling before Caleb, she set a hand on his small shoulder. "Stay here. Keep the fire. I'll bring your father home." His eyes pleaded with her, but the boy only nodded, clutching her hand 1 second before letting go. Evelyn stepped into the storm. The wind struck like shards of glass, the snow blinding her to all but a blur of white. She bent low, forcing each step toward the barn. There, in the drifted yard, she saw a body crumpled in the snow. Thomas. He lay half-buried, one shoulder stained dark, hands still gripping a bundle of hay, as if even in collapse he would not surrender. "Thomas!" Evelyn fell to her knees, her hand trembling as it touched his frozen face. His breath was faint, but present. Blood soaked through his coat, arm gone purple with cold. She bit down, hauling him up, dragging his weight against her slight frame. Step by step, teeth clenched till her lip bled, she fought the storm. The cabin door burst open, wind clawing inside, snuffing the fire near dead. Caleb ran to her, tears bright, helping lift his father to the bed. Evelyn rushed to the hearth, sparked the flames alive, then returned to him. Thomas drifted in fever, skin burning, sweat beading his brow. Evelyn tore away his soaked coat, peeled back the layers beneath. The wound at his shoulder was torn wide, crimson deepening. Her hands shook but did not falter. She cleansed it with heated water, bound it with strips of cloth, wrapped him until the bleeding slowed. He groaned, lids fluttering. For a breath, his gray eyes cracked open, dulled and questioning. Why she had braved death for him. "Don't leave us," she whispered, voice breaking. "Don't leave Caleb. Don't leave me." He could not speak, only panted, but his bloodied hand reached, closed weakly around her wrist. That frail grip carried more than words ever could. The storm roared on, but inside, firelight and the heat of bodies pressed close pushed the cold away. Evelyn sat at his side, clasping his hand. Caleb, exhausted, curled in a chair, wooden horse clutched tight, sleep finally taking him. When the pain eased, Thomas stirred again. He fixed his gaze on her, rough voice rasping. "You shouldn't have gone out. Too dangerous. And you thought I'd let you lie there and never come back?" Her eyes burned in the firelight, a silence taut as a drawn bowstring. Then his good hand lifted, brushed her cheek. Clumsy, rough, but it set her trembling. It had been so long since anyone touched her like she was something to keep, not discard. Evelyn bent, lips trembling against his. At first a desperate plea, a gasp torn from fear. But when he answered, the kiss deepened, fierce, as if two souls had collided in the dark and clung to life. It was no vow, no duty. It was instinct. Terror of loss turned into the hunger to hold on. That night, as the gale battered the walls, Evelyn and Thomas drew together. No words, no ornament, only two worn bodies clinging to warmth, proving they were alive, proving they still needed one another. When at last she lay still in his arms, chest rising strong beneath her ear, Evelyn closed her eyes. The storm outside screamed, but in that moment she knew something had shifted forever. No longer just a bargain for survival. Between them, love had begun. The storm passed, leaving the Nebraska prairie scarred with ice and drifts piled high against the fences. Yet inside the Hale cabin, the air had shifted. It was no longer a shelter for three souls bound only by circumstance. It had become a home, alive with footsteps, with the crackle of the hearth, with the rhythm of shared breath. Thomas lay in the main room bed, his shoulder bound, but his color returning day by day. Evelyn tended his meals, his medicines, adjusted the pillows so he could rest easier. Caleb stayed near, unwilling to let either slip from his sight, as if the storm had carved into him the fear of losing both father and new mother in the same night. Each morning, Evelyn opened the shutters wide. The glass, once filmed with grime, now shone clear. Sunlight poured across the floor, catching on her thin but steady face. Thomas often watched her at that moment. His gaze no longer weighed her like a stranger at his door. There was something softer now, a feeling he could not shape into words. "You don't have to do it all," Thomas said one morning, voice rough. Evelyn set the bowl of porridge down, shook her head. "If I don't, who will?" He said nothing, then gave a faint smile, a rare thing, breaking through the hard lines carved by years of burden. At night, Caleb often crept from his small bed, curling near the fire where his father and Evelyn sat. Once, when Thomas drifted into sleep under the balm of medicine, the boy's head slid onto Evelyn's lap. In that half-dream state, his lips parted. "Mama!" The sound was cracked, gravelly from a throat long silent. Evelyn stiffened, tears rising sharp. She bent, stroking his tangle of dark hair. Thomas stirred, waking in time to hear it clear. His eyes found Evelyn's across the dim glow. In them, no suspicion, no cold bargain remained. Only recognition. This woman had stepped into the deepest hollow of their lives and filled it with a tenderness no one else could. The next morning, as Evelyn brought warm water to tend his wound, Thomas caught her hand. "Evelyn, this isn't an arrangement anymore." His voice was firm, steady. "From now on, it's a partnership, together." Simple words, but for him they were a vow. Evelyn nodded, her hand still in his. For a long breath, they needed no further speech. Their eyes spoke enough, the fire crackling as if to bear witness. Caleb ran in then. Wooden horse clutched tight, clambered onto a chair, and leaned into Evelyn. He said nothing, but the way he pressed against her side was its own declaration. Thomas understood. The boy had chosen, and so had he. From that day, Evelyn was no longer the widow come begging for work. She was the mother Caleb whispered for in his sleep, the wife Thomas began to see with the eyes of a true companion. Outside, the snow held fast, the earth still locked in frost, but within the cabin walls, spring had already begun. Morning broke clear, though snow still clung thick along the trail into town. Wagon ruts cut deep, winding across a sheet of ice that cracked beneath the wheels. Evelyn sat in the old wooden wagon, Caleb beside her, his small hand woven into her roughened palm. Thomas held the reins, his shoulder bound, but his gaze steady. "You're sure you're strong enough?" Evelyn asked quietly. He only nodded, voice clipped but resolute. "Folk need to see we don't bow." The town came into view, weather-worn wooden houses, gray from wind and years, thin threads of chimney smoke curling into the cold sky. When the wagon halted before Henderson's general store, heads turned. Men outside the saloon broke off their talk. Wives with market baskets leaned close to one another, whispering. Evelyn felt each look pricking her back like needles. She knew well what fed their murmurs. A black widow stepping down from Thomas Hale's wagon, the same man who had lived shut away since his wife's death. She squeezed Caleb's hand. He tilted his dark eyes up at her, wordless, as if asking, "Should we go on?" Evelyn drew a breath, lifted her chin, and stepped down first. "Come on, son," she said aloud, offering her free hand for Caleb to take. In that instant, Thomas came around the wagon, planting himself at her side, his stare sweeping the onlookers. His voice carried just enough for the nearest to hear. "Mrs. Hale, you go on in and pick out cloth. The boy and I will follow." The air shifted like canvas tearing in the wind. Mrs. Hale. The words spread fast through the street, caught in every ear. Henderson stiffened behind his counter, then forced a smile. Women whispered sharper, their eyes wide. Evelyn froze, warmth rushing to her cheeks. She had never heard him call her that before others. The title fell like a shield before her, a declaration plain as stone. No longer the widow Carter begging for work, but mistress of the Hale Ranch. She lifted her head, led Caleb inside. The bell above the door rang clear, the air within heavy with flour, cloth, and dried tobacco. Henderson bobbed his head, though his eyes darted between her and Thomas, measuring. Evelyn chose bolts of fabric, brown for work clothes, blue for Caleb, and one rare strip of white, not for vanity, but to sew a tablecloth. She placed them on the counter, her voice even. "Add needles, buttons, and a stick of candy for the boy." Caleb's lips parted in a small smile at the word candy. Evelyn squeezed his hand, a simple gesture that lit his eyes brighter than the store's lamp. Thomas entered then, slow, upright. As Henderson wrote in his ledger, Thomas set his hand against Evelyn's back, a brief, unconscious touch, but enough for every witness to see. The whispers flared. He's claiming her outright. A widow, and black at that. Evelyn did not lower her gaze. She held Caleb close at her side, lifted her chin, a calm smile softening her face. Outside, the wind, bit sharp, yet her chest warmed. She caught Caleb looking from his father to her, his eyes glowing with a trust newly born. On the road home, words were scarce. Snow gleamed white across the fields. At last, Thomas spoke. "They'll talk for a while." "Let them," Evelyn answered, her eyes on the endless pale horizon. "What matters is, your boy won't have to bow his head again." Thomas turned, studied her long. In his gray eyes there was a gentleness that had never been there before. He said nothing more, only tightened the reins. His other hand shifted, brushing the back of hers, a hidden touch, meant for her alone. The wagon rolled on, leaving behind the murmuring town. For the three within, life had altered. This was no arrangement. This was choice, clear and public, sealed in the words Thomas had spoken before them all. Mrs. Hale. The March wind carried the thaw of spring, snow melting along the fence line to reveal black, damp earth beneath. Evelyn was hanging wash on the line, Caleb nearby with his wooden horse, when a well-kept carriage rolled into the yard. Dust still hung in the air when a tall woman stepped down, dressed in fine Denver fashion, a feathered hat trembling in the breeze. "Thomas?" Her voice rang out, sharp and cold as metal. Thomas emerged from the barn, his limp still heavy from the wound winter had left behind. He stopped short, his eyes dimming. "Catherine." Evelyn knew at once. Thomas's sister, Catherine Hale, long settled in Denver. No explanation was needed. The air itself grew taut. Catherine strode forward, her eyes flicking over Evelyn, pausing with pointed weight. "So it's true," Catherine said, her tone like flint. "You've brought another woman into Mary's house, into my sister-in-law's place before her grave has cooled." Heat rose to Evelyn's face, but she held her spine straight, gaze steady. "I have not replaced anyone. I'm here, for Caleb, because this house needed breath again." Catherine's laugh was brittle, sharp. "Breath? You stand where Mary once stood, sleep in her bed, now teach her son to call you mother? Shameless." Evelyn's hands trembled around the cloth she held, but she bit back her tongue. Thomas stepped forward, voice hard. "Enough, Catherine. Evelyn saved my life in the storm. She's kept this ranch from falling. And Caleb is Hale blood." Catherine cut in, eyes flashing. "He needs protection, not a widow looking for shelter." The yard fell silent save for the hiss of wind along the fence. Caleb had been standing on the porch, wooden horse clutched tight, eyes wide at the fury flaring between grown folk. Then, with sudden resolve, he stepped into the yard. His lips quivered, throat straining to force words that seemed torn from stone. Broken, rough, but clear. "Mama stays." All three adults froze. Evelyn's breath caught sharp in her chest. It was the first time Caleb had spoken the word. Not in a fever dream, not whispered half asleep, but aloud, strong, before them all. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. She looked at her nephew, the boy who had stayed silent since Mary's passing, speaking again, and the word he chose was not her sister's name, but Evelyn's. She turned aside, shoulders shaking. "God above, he's never spoken. Not to me. Not to anyone." Her voice broke, tears running down her cheeks. Evelyn sank to her knees, arms folding Caleb close. "I'm here, my son," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't leave you." Caleb buried into her shoulder, clutching her dress as though afraid she'd vanish. Thomas watched, the iron gray of his eyes glistening. Catherine steadied herself, wiped at her face, her voice softened by grief. "Perhaps I was wrong. Evelyn, if he's chosen you, if his voice has returned because of you, then maybe Mary would have wanted it so." She came closer, laying a trembling hand on Caleb's dark hair. "My boy, you've been silent too long. If this is what brings your voice back, I've no right to deny it." Evelyn lifted her gaze, eyes wet. "I never sought to replace Mary, only to keep her spirit alive, in Caleb's smile." Catherine studied her a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Then do it, for the boy, and for Thomas." In that moment, the quarrel eased, suspicion melted. On the Nebraska prairie, a new family was claimed, not by papers or gossip, but by the first word torn from a child's silence, a word that bound them all together. Mama stays. That spring came slow but certain. The last of the snow melted from the fence line, revealing dark, damp soil beneath. Evelyn knelt in the garden, hands muddy as she pressed carrot and cabbage seeds into the furrows. Beside her, Caleb worked with a small wooden spade Thomas had whittled for him. When the boy dropped a handful of seed, Evelyn gently corrected, her smile soft. "Good, Caleb," she whispered. This time he answered, not with silence but with a word, halting and rough. "Good." Evelyn froze, then smiled until tears blurred her sight. Thomas, near the barn, pretended to busy himself with fence posts, but his ears strained toward them. Since the boy had spoken those first words, "Mama stays," his voice had returned more and more. Each new word lit Evelyn's face, as if it set the whole yard aglow. Inside, Evelyn hung fresh curtains, spread the white tablecloth she had sewn from that Denver cloth. Supper was no longer stale bread alone, but steaming soup, sometimes a pie. Caleb laughed aloud now, a sound so strange Thomas had stilled the first time he heard it, turning aside quickly to hide the wet in his eyes. One evening, Evelyn was tending the fire when Thomas came in with an armful of wood. He set it down, turned, and nearly brushed against her. His hand shot out, rough palm grazing her waist. The touch lasted but a breath. Yet Evelyn stiffened, heart racing. She looked up. Their eyes met. For a moment, both stilled, then turned away to their tasks. But afterward, each accidental touch carried new weight. Not clumsy anymore, but quiet acknowledgement. Another day, the three of them worked in the hay shed. Thomas stood on the ladder, passing bundles down. Evelyn caught them, their hands meeting in the exchange. At first, he pulled away too quickly. Then, slower, he passed the next, letting their fingers linger. Evelyn said nothing, only pressed her lips together, though the faintest smile tugged at her. Caleb saw, giggled, and lifted his wooden horse to hide his face, as if guarding their secret. The fields outside grew green again. Evelyn and Caleb planted marigolds along the fence, so mornings brought not just the scent of grass, but the sweet drift of blossoms. From Denver, Catherine sent small packages, seeds, books for Caleb. Evelyn welcomed them with gratitude, knowing they meant more than their use. They meant acceptance. One quiet afternoon, Thomas led his horse across the pasture, Evelyn walking with Caleb beside him. The prairie stretched golden in the sun, birds calling from distant trees. Caleb ran ahead, small legs kicking up dust. Evelyn watched him, then turned to Thomas. He seemed changed. His eyes no longer carried that heavy shadow. Though words were still few, his silence felt lighter. "Do you see?" she said softly. "Caleb not only speaks now, he laughs. He's alive again." Thomas halted, hand steadying the reins. He turned toward her, his voice low. "Not just the boy, the house too." In that, look, Evelyn understood. He no longer saw her as a stranger widow at his door, but as the woman beside him, rebuilding what had been broken. They needed no vows, no fine phrases. Only the weight of a glance, the brush of hands at work, and the boy's laughter weaving them into one. That spring, the Hale Ranch emerged from winter not merely endured, but renewed. It lived again, through patience, through shared labor, and through a love sprouting quiet and strong, like green shoots rising from dark soil after a long frost. That summer, the Nebraska sky stretched wide and blue, the sun spilling gold across the prairie like a great cloth unfurled. The wind carried the scent of young grain, rustling through the cottonwoods by the creek. Beneath one old giant, proud and shading, Thomas chose to marry Evelyn. No church, no grandeur. This wedding bore no mark of survival, no trace of bargain. It was a vow, plain and true, before land and sky, and before those who had seen their journey. A beginning born not of need, but of choice. The townsfolk came together, setting rows of wooden benches under the tree. Women tied bundles of wildflowers along the aisles, white and violet bright against the green grass. Children laughed and darted about, their joy rising like a summer hymn. Catherine stood off to the side, simple in dress, peace at last upon her face, her doubts gone, leaving only quiet gladness. Evelyn stepped from the cabin in a cream dress Catherine had sent from Denver. It was not elaborate, but in the morning light the fabric glowed. Her hands trembled, yet her heart steadied when she saw Caleb waiting ahead. Shirt crisp, hair combed neat, a shy smile touching his lips. Thomas stood beneath the cottonwood, coat worn but pressed, a yellow marigold from Evelyn's garden pinned at his chest. When he saw her approach, his gray eyes, once so cold, lit bright, not as a man merely surviving storms, but as one who had chosen to stay, to trust. The town preacher opened his book, his voice steady, deep, carried on the breeze and mingled with the birdsong. His blessing needed no flourish. It rang true as earth itself. Evelyn's chest tightened, her hand gripping her skirt. Then her glance fell to Caleb's bright eyes, and calm returned. When the rings were called for, all turned to the boy. Caleb walked forward slowly, holding a small wooden box tight in both hands. He opened it to reveal two plain iron bands, rings Thomas had forged from old nails in the barn fire. The boy held them up, gaze steady. Thomas took them, then knelt to his son's height, giving a silent nod of thanks. He rose, slid one onto Evelyn's hand. "This ring," he said, voice rough but firm, "is not polished nor fine, but it was made in fire and steel, like what we've come through." The words hung in the hush. Evelyn's hands shook as she received it, tears brimming. Then Caleb reached into his pocket and drew out a thin gold ring, aged and dulled by time. The crowd stilled. Evelyn knew it at once. It was Mary's wedding ring. The boy lifted it, lips trembling. "Mama." Evelyn broke, tears running freely. This was no whispered dream, no half-uttered sleep. This was his choice, plain in the light of day. With both hands he offered it to her, not as a relic of the past, but as his last seal that she belonged. Evelyn sank to her knees, wrapping him close, her cheek against his tangled dark hair. "I'm here, son," she whispered. "I'll always be here." Around them, Catherine pressed a hand to her face. Neighbors who once whispered now bowed their heads, eyes wet. They were not witnessing a wedding alone, but the stitching of a family, bound not by force but by love and choosing. Evelyn placed the gold ring into Thomas's hand. He slid it onto her finger, his calloused hand closing over hers. Their eyes met, no words needed, the vow already written clear. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Thomas bent and kissed her. It was not the frantic kiss of the storm, nor the clumsy one of two strangers. It was the first kiss in daylight, before all, the seal of having found and chosen one another. Applause rose, rolling as the wind swept the cottonwood leaves. Children cheered, women smiled, men nodded firm. Caleb stood between them, his small hands clasped tight in theirs, his dark eyes shining like stars. In that moment, Evelyn knew this was no longer a house patched for survival, but a home renewed. It was built from grief, steadied by patience, and at last raised upon love. And the wedding beneath the cottonwood, simple yet full, would forever stand as witness to that choice. That spring returned to the Nebraska prairie not with biting frost, but with the scent of damp soil and young grass rising from beneath the thaw. The fields before the ranch spread green, dotted with purple and yellow wildflowers trembling in the breeze. The barn no longer stood in gloom, the pasture lay clean, and the garden behind the house, where Evelyn had knelt day after day to sow, now pushed up neat rows of tender shoots. Along the creek, the cottonwoods stretched wide, sheltering all that belonged to this home. In the sunlit kitchen, Evelyn placed a jar of wildflowers in the center of the table. Their faint fragrance mingled with the warm smell of fresh bread, filling the room with quiet comfort. Caleb sat on the long bench, hunched over, a blunt pencil clutched in hand, working in the worn exercise book Catherine had sent from Denver. His tongue peaked at the corner of his lips, his dark eyes fixed with the gravity of a grown man on serious work. Now and then he looked up, seeking Evelyn's nod, before bending again to his task. Thomas entered from the door, boots muddy, shoulders carrying the scent of hay. He stopped short. Before him was a scene he'd once thought impossible. His son, once mute with grief, now whispering, reading, writing. The woman nearby, hair falling soft at her shoulders, watching him with patience and tenderness. And in that space the faint murmur of a boy's voice, an echo long absent from these walls. "Finished," Caleb whispered. His voice was thin, unsteady, but it carried weight. He slid the notebook toward Evelyn. She opened it, her heart catching at the crooked words. "My family." Beneath, 3 lines spelled out in shaky letters. Papa Thomas, Mama Evelyn, Mama Mary. The room stilled. Evelyn's eyes blurred, her throat tight. Thomas stepped closer, bending to read. Those misshapen letters held both past and present. The love for Mary, the wife now gone, and the love for Evelyn, who had come not to erase but to carry forward. Evelyn knelt, pulling Caleb into her arms. Tears streamed, yet her smile broke through. "That's right, son," she whispered, kissing his soft hair. "That's our family." Thomas laid his rough hand upon them both, scarred, weathered, yet steady with warmth. He did not need words. His grip alone told her the circle had closed, not in loss, but in wholeness. That evening, as the sun sank red against the horizon, the three sat on the porch together. The spring wind carried the scent of tilled earth and green grass. Caleb sat between them, his small hands clasping his father's on one side and his mother's on the other. Evelyn felt the warmth flow through that fragile bridge of fingers, binding the three as one. Thomas turned, his gaze resting on her. No longer distant, no longer guarded. In his gray eyes lay only trust and peace, a man who had lost much, but learned to open again. Evelyn answered with a soft smile, her eyes shining with the unspoken words. I am here. I will always be here. The prairie burned with sunset fire, orange and red spilling across the wide sky. Evelyn leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. Caleb nestled against her chest. None spoke. There was no need. In the stillness, Evelyn understood. Love does not erase the past, nor deny what once was. It widens the circle, making space for the new while honoring the old. Mary would always live on memory and in Caleb's heart. And Evelyn would carry that thread forward, not replacing, but continuing. This family, broken once, had found its way closed again. Mary was not forgotten. Evelyn was no longer an outsider, and Caleb, once silent through his grief, now could speak Mama with a whole heart. Hands tightened together as the last light faded. An unseen thread bound past, present, and the life yet to come. At Hale Ranch, winter had given way not just to spring, but to a true home. A home not perfect, but full of love. A family not ended by loss, but widened by healing. And there, love, plain and steadfast, would endure. As the tale closes under the prairie sunset, we are left with a truth as old as the land. Love does not replace, it gathers in. Evelyn did not erase Mary's place, but continued it, so Caleb could call Mama without fear. Thomas, once locked away in grief, had learned to see the present without losing the past. For those who have lived long enough to know loss and parting, perhaps this story feels familiar. That when life slams one door, it still leaves room for another to open, softer and kinder. If this story touched your heart, share a memory of your own in the comments. And if you wish to walk with us through more Wild West love stories, remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, for the prairie has many more tales waiting to be told.